Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're so glad that you are able to join us today for this important conversation about college accommodations. Whether you are a high school counselor, educator, parent, or student, we know that navigating the transition to college can be overwhelming, especially when it comes to ensuring the right supports are in place when you arrive to any one of our universities of Wisconsin. We are very fortunate to have expert presenters today who will share their insights and experiences on the accommodation process and how to access resources on our campuses. With that, we'll start with introductions. My name is Maya Mua, and I serve as an outreach specialist with the Universities of Wisconsin Go Wisconsin team.
I'm Katie Bublitz. I'm the director of the Services for Students with Disabilities offices at UW-Eau. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a white woman with brown hair that's pulled back and a gray sweater today.
Good afternoon, folks. My name is Alicia Ranky-Tudhill. I use she, her pronouns. As it notes there, I am the Disability Resource Center Director at UW-River Falls. And as a visual description of myself, I'm a white woman, blonde hair, blue and gold on the glasses. I have a green turtleneck and a green cardigan that also has gold on it. That must be the theme for me today, but really happy to join this call today.
And thanks for joining us, everyone. My name is Wesley Quintana, and I serve as an outreach specialist. I'm kind of here for technical support, but I do appreciate everybody being here today.
During today's webinar, we'll explore trends in the universities of Wisconsin, discuss student accommodations at the college level, and round out today's webinar with any questions that you might have. So we encourage you to use the Q&A function here in Zoom to ask any questions at the end. With that, I'll hand it over to our presenters to get us started.
All right, thanks again, folks. Again, I'm Alicia Ranky-Tudhill, and the first thing we're going to kind of start off with is introducing an access statement. This has been kind of in other spaces as well, so you may be familiar, but it's a great way to start and kick off our session this afternoon. So just as a reminder, when you're showing up in this space, make sure to take into consideration your own needs for today. I know I have before I hopped on the call, making sure we're keeping in mind our bodies, our minds, what we need to do to successfully engage in this topic this afternoon. Show up as you are. If you need to lay down, pace, stem, stand, eat, drink, whatever you need to do, make sure that you're doing that. We welcome that in this space so folks can participate. Obviously, we're all joining virtually. So again, you can engage again how you want. There's not a requirement to obviously have your camera on. Just again, show up in the space that's comfortable for you. And again, just give yourself permission with your body and mind to take space if you need it. Otherwise, with that, I will turn it over to Katie for the next slide.
This is Katie. So we're going to start by looking at the Universities of Wisconsin student trends. So I want to highlight that these numbers reflect the students that have registered with the Disability Services Office. So students don't have to register with Disability Services offices at the post-secondary level, but these numbers are showing students that have. So here we have a graph that has a 9-year trend. As you can see, there's been an increase. From 2015 until 2023, that's the last time we did our data. So over 9 years, there's been a 95% growth in the number of UW students connecting with disability services offices. It is important to note that despite most universities experiencing decreasing enrollment over the year, especially this more recent years, the number of disabled students seeking accommodations continues to grow across the state. Policies and guidelines for documentation has not changed, but the number of students accessing higher education with disabilities has significantly increased. So just some key points to keep in mind as students transition from K through 12 to post-secondary is at post-secondary, students are not responsible for sharing their accommodations with, they are responsible for sharing their accommodations with their instructors, not disability services. So if a student does reach out to us, we get them set up with accommodations. It's up to the student to choose which accommodations they want to implement in each class. It's not an all or nothing or one size fits all. You know, if some of our students, if they're in classes maybe such as math or hard sciences, they'll maybe use more of their accommodations versus other classes. We always tell the students that they know themselves best. They're the expert in themselves. And so they know when which accommodation would be helpful for them. Another thing to note is that accommodations are not retroactive. So if a student does decide to, we typically here try the first exam just to see how it goes. That's the student's decision, but the student can't come back and say, actually, I changed my mind. I want to use my accommodations and take that test again. That's not something that we can do here at the post-secondary. All of this being said, the disability services offices teach students self-advocacy skills, and we will support them when needed. Students are learning. They're learning how to advocate for themselves. They're learning, typically this is the first time that they've had to do this themselves. And so disability services really support students in learning how to be an advocate and talking about disability disclosure and when you have to do it and when you don't have to do it. And a big point also at post-secondary is that our accommodation letters do not have any disability related information or diagnostic information. So students can choose if they want to share their disability with an instructor or not. It's up to them. So we also talk about kind of the legal guidelines and framework of sharing your disability or your diagnosis with someone. The key for any successful usage of the reasonable accommodations is communication with the instructor. So we really work with students on learning how to advocate for themselves, but also work with the instructors so they know how they can best support the student as well.
All right. Thanks again, Katie. So we're going to transition here. There's going to be a couple of slides that are in this bar graph format that we're talking about common accommodations and recognizing, as Katie noted, it's a case-by-case basis. So this is not listing every possible accommodation under the sun that we could potentially approve for a student, but giving a general consensus of what's kind of been seen across the system. We do have an annual report that all of the system campuses participate in where we've gotten a lot of this data from. So on the bar graph, you can see testing, note-taking, flexible attendance and due dates, alternative formats, and housing. And so when you're looking at each kind of area, you're also comparing that to the number of students who are approved for that particular accommodation, right? And so I don't think it's necessarily surprising that testing is the most common reason why students connect with our office for accommodations. Again, if you're familiar with this work, it's pretty commonplace. So I think standards, right? Extra time, distraction reduced location, enlarged text or font, those types of things are all kind of falling under that category. And that's been consistently increasing over time, right, in that area. And I think that's to be expected. I think one of the areas I kind of want to highlight in the note-taking component is something that's consistent across all of our campuses in the Universities of Wisconsin system, is that all of our campuses have a software system called Glean Audio Note Taker, which is a more independent-based technology-centered note-taking option for students. And so really promoting that independent awareness and using assistive technology. And so there's definitely been a shift in utilizing that more consistently as technology has grown and as students are more confident in those areas. I'm not saying that people aren't doing peer-to-peer note-taking, that in some instances that's appropriate, but a lot of campuses are kind of shifting and moving. So some of the things that a student may notice is that we'll have a lot of the same accommodations, but they may not look exactly the same. So being prepared for some transition and some changes in how things operate and how they kind of move from day to day. The flexible attendance and due dates is an area I want to spend a little bit more time on because you can see that there's been a noticeable increase in that area. And to provide maybe a little context as to why that is, if again, referencing that annual report, you'll hear me say this a couple of times. Across our system, 37% of our students primarily connect for a psychological disability. So that's the most common reason why students connect. And that is oftentimes indicative of when those accommodations are utilized. Again, it's not exclusively that, but a lot of our students have some of those barriers as it pertains to successfully engaging, whether that's in attendance or needing some time away, if they're having symptoms, right? So some of that is correlative to some of the trends that we've seen, as well as more and more students with chronic illness seeking out accommodations and support. So ultimately, those are kind of some of the factors that contribute to some of those changes and some of the need for those areas. And so over time, it used to be common disabilities was psych, ADHD, and learning disability for the most common across the system. And again, it varies a little bit from campus to campus, but consistently it's been psych, ADHD, and chronic health. So there's been some shift in students connecting as well. Alternative formats has been pretty consistent. It's to be expected with the type of enrollment we have for students in sometimes a learning disability area or other spaces. So it's been pretty consistent. That can be audiobooks or alt text. And again, campuses kind of do this differently in terms of how that's coordinated, depending on their textbook services or rental programs, or you buy your textbooks. But ultimately, there are access to those things. It just may look a little different from campus to campus. And then housing, I know the next slide will have a little more in-depth on the housing piece, but that is definitely an area that I think all of us can attest to in being a huge growth area. I don't know about Katie, but we are just doing housing accommodations 24/7 right now, it seems like. So definitely an area to be mindful of as students are transitioning, because we're seeing more and more students needing that support. So with that, I'll turn it over to Katie for the next one.
This is Katie, and I'll go over other common accommodations. So we'll start with emotional support animals. I would say the last 5 to 7 years, there's been a large increase in emotional support animals. Emotional support animals are not service animals, and they are not therapy animals. So it is a different process, different set of laws and regulations that they follow with that as well. So we work very closely with our housing and residence life office with emotional support animals. The next area is captioning, media captioning. As you can see, there's been a large increase in that as well. We at UW-Eau Claire saw a large increase once COVID hit. Students who had hearing loss that didn't need accommodations prior to COVID, but needed them after, reached out. People were wearing masks, things were online. So we work with a lot of students with varying degrees of hearing loss, also auditory processing disorders, other diagnoses that may need captioning. Temporary accommodations. As you can see, temporary accommodations have kind of ranged all over the board here. I would say at UW-Eau Claire, we've seen an increase in temporary accommodations strictly around concussions. We have a really strong athletic training department, and they take concussions very seriously. Other temporary accommodations could include things such as, a student had surgery, or they are maybe using crutches or a broken limb, something along those lines, where the student maybe only needs accommodations for one semester. And that's where disability services can step in and assist with that. The next area is classroom furniture. So this can be, for example, students who use mobility devices. We work with our facilities department frequently on making sure we have height adjustable desks for our students to access, or that lab equipment or computer equipment is accessible to individuals, whether they have mobility disability, physical disability, whatever it may be. So we have a really strong partnership with our facilities department on that, because that's kind of a moving pieces, who's got what where game. Speech to text software, CART, so live captioning, transcription of auditory materials. Transportation. At UW-Eau Claire, we have a lot of students with transportation related accommodations. Our campus is set up where housing and dining is on upper campus, we call it. It's up a very large hill. And then we also have part of campus that is across a river. So while it's beautiful, that can pose a lot of difficulties for students that have not only physical disabilities and mobility related disabilities, but health conditions as well. So we partner with contracts, that have accessible lifts for their vans for some of our students that have that need. We also have some on-campus transportation that students can use, as well as working with the city bus system to make sure that those are fully accessible for students who need those. For the next area is meal and dietary. So we work very closely with our dining and food services. We work with students that have, medical or, dietary restrictions, not just preferences. So we make sure that they have access to areas that are free of the 9 major allergens is what we work with on. So that's really a kind of a partnership between the two offices, and then sign language interpreting as needed. So these are some of the frequently used campus resources. Counseling services, as Alicia said, 37% of students across the state have some kind of mental health need. And it's significant. And this is their first time being away. So they are maybe not able to see their counselor from home because of, counseling policies and regulations. So getting students connected with counseling services right away is very, very important. We work with them frequently. Some counseling services offices have more of a short-term therapy model, but they can work with students to find a permanent, long-term counselor in the community. Student health services, again, a lot of students will come to campus and maybe not have a diagnosis due to multiple reasons. So we do partner with student health services frequently on, diagnostic information, but also just medication management and support. Dean of Students, we work frequently with the Dean of Students office as well. They're a great resource for students, especially if students are missing the kind of long-term absences. So on our campus, it's more than 5 days. So if a student is hospitalized or a medical procedure, something like that, we work with Dean of Students to make sure that they can advocate to the faculty. They also do, cover any Title IX related needs or academic misconduct. We'll work with students if they are experiencing academic misconduct, and their disability may play a factor in that as well. We also have TRIO or student support services. These are vital services, so I would definitely make sure students are reaching out to these programs on campus. These programs really offer a lot of supplemental support that disability services offices can't. So for example, supplemental academic advising or tutoring services. We also have, career major exploration for students who aren't quite sure what they want to do. So those areas are out of the realm typically of disability services offices, but they're a great resource and partner to have for a student. And then any student success center, whether it's general campus tutoring, writing centers, math labs, study skills. A lot of students utilize these supports because they have to learn how to study a different way typically than they did in high school. So having students access these supports and resources right away is really vital to their success.
All right, so just a couple more slides here. So one of the things I kind of want to tie in before I kind of talk about 2 slides regarding reasonable accommodations, I do kind of want to preface that there have been other presentations through Go Wisconsin about getting connected and all these different things. And I think one thing to keep in mind that our goal today is really thinking about when they're there on campus, what this looks like, right? Ultimately, let's start talking about resources, using accommodations long-term. So when I'm talking, I'll kind of be talking about first year and then kind of driving a little bit into like their time throughout campus as a university student and how using accommodations may change or differ throughout their time here. So one of the things I want to highlight first is alternative testing accommodations. I think this is one that, at least in my experience, where sometimes when we're coming in and doing expectation settings, students may feel like they may just be able to go and ask their instructor the day of the exam that they want to take it somewhere else or they want extra time and expect that to be coordinated in that regard. That's not going to be a realistic expectation at the college level. Many of our disability services or disability resource centers, whatever you want to call them, access centers, there's a lot of different titles. We also have test centers built into our offices, right? And so most campuses will have some general policies and procedures around like how late is a request, the process for that. So students do need to be mindful ahead of time about when and how and if they want to use accommodations. So it kind of gets to some of the things that Katie mentioned earlier too that go into the next part of this point on the next bullet, but recognizing that we're not automatically having them come to our test center every time. We're not making assumptions about what they need. And I know for some students that may sound repetitive, like I need to do this every single time, but ultimately it is their decision, right? And as Katie noted, I think one of the big things that come up with that is taking ownership when you don't do that, right? And recognizing the consequences if maybe you don't use them, right? And it's a learning opportunity, but we obviously can't force students to do that. But just making sure that students understand the process and understand again that the accommodations are there. They may just look different and operate different. And again, making sure that they're aware of that. Kind of moving on, again, thinking about this throughout the student's collegiate career, their first semester, their second semester, going into their sophomore year. Again, we do not make assumptions for what students need and if they need it in every course. I think one of the things that is important to recognize too is that they're coming independently to this process, right? And so we don't make assumptions, we don't make decisions without their behalf, and they need to be an active partner in those conversations throughout their collegiate career. Also kind of, again, thinking about major course and format. Oftentimes the pedagogy or the instructional design of a course can ultimately, if an instructor is very universally design friendly and they're making a course really accessible for students, a student may not necessarily need an accommodation if the course is structured that way, right? And so that's why I think it's important to recognize too, from the transition from K-12 to college, that instructors have a lot of different ways that they teach, a lot of different expectations, a lot of different styles. Not everything's lecture based. There's hands-on. A lot of it is dependent on a major. So what we're seeing on our campus historically too is our first and second year students who are more in general classes are typically utilizing their accommodations more regularly because they're more traditionally structured courses. And then once students really get in their junior and senior year, like our teacher education program, a lot of our students, we may see them less because they're really just doing curriculum hands-on observation work where an accommodation may not be necessary. So recognizing that there's nothing wrong with that, right? And sometimes the environment really just determines what they'll need throughout the course of their time as a student. And then the fourth thing here is, I think, is really important to recognize is that if there is a concern or an issue about whether they know how to use the accommodation, for many of us, right, we may have one or two interactions with the student throughout their career. We may have 3 or 4 in a semester, depending on the student, because students really are engaging with us the way that they want to, right? Or what's comfortable for them. So we want to ensure that we're not only approving the accommodation for the student on the front end, but making sure that they're understanding long-term how to successfully implement this or utilize that, because an accommodation is only effective, as the understanding. And as Katie noted, I think one of the big tips regardless is communication. So even if they're not 100% sure, like if this is right, or am I going about this the right way, it's better to have maybe an awkward communication than no communication at all, right? So just making sure students are aware of that, but making sure that they connect back with us if they don't remember how to do something, or maybe they haven't used them in a while and they're like, hey, I didn't use this last semester, I don't remember how to do this. Just having them come back and do that. I think the other piece of this as well is resolving issues and concerns. I think this is pretty obvious, but if we don't know something's going on, it's very hard for us to work to advocate and resolve a concern for a student, right? So maybe it's a question with an instructor, or maybe the accommodation is a little more complicated and it's new and they're trying to find that navigational space. They can always come back to us and have those discussions. But again, the big piece is advocating and communicating and doing it early, hopefully before things have already kind of snowballed. That's really what we want to prevent. So again, those are just some ongoing things that are pretty typical as a student is on campus and throughout their collegiate career. So we can advance to the next slide. Okay, I think I got it. They're very similar. So this is, again, thinking more long-term. Katie already kind of noted the requirements for students to notify their instructors of their accommodations and us being a facilitative support if needed. But if we're thinking long-term, right, about students and the supports that they need, whether this is spring term or their fall term of the next year, students do still have a responsibility to notify them every semester, right? You have different classes, you have different instructors, you have different things to be aware of. So in that regard, that is an ongoing thing that students need to continue to do in order to be successfully accommodated in their courses moving forward. I do think, at least on our campus, I think sometimes there's some confusion on that. Well, I told them that one time and then I thought it would transfer over, but ultimately recognizing that it is a confidential process, as Katie noted, and we're not automatically doing on their behalf. We're not sharing it with more people than what is necessary. And so just reminding them that that is a process each semester that they need to engage in. A lot of our campuses, most of our campuses use a accommodation software system known as AIM. Everybody has kind of their own interfaces, or what they call it, on their campus. And if campuses don't use that software, every campus has an accommodation software system. So students should really get familiarized with that, because that's really their go-to hub for all accommodations throughout their collegiate career, notifying their instructors, scheduling tests. We have an appointment feature through there. So it's a really good place for students to continue to be updated in that regard. And then if we're moving on to kind of, again, ongoing support, things that happen, students may need to change their accommodation plans over time. That's not uncommon. Maybe they want to try something without it first, and then they want to revisit and say, actually, I think we need to add this. This is actually a bigger concern than I thought. But ultimately, we are not doing it again without their permission or having them engage in the process. They're the most important partner in this, in talking through what those things are. Even if sometimes we're not sure if that's an accommodation, we can always have those discussions. And I think the one thing that we've noticed quite a bit on our campus is that We'll have students who come with a diagnosis, have an accommodation plan from the K-12 setting, but they get a new diagnosis that is impacting them in a different way. And they may need to kind of look at their accommodations again and revisit that because it's uniquely disrupting maybe a different area of their day-to-day functioning than maybe another accommodation, right? So again, it's really up to the student, though, to continue to let us know throughout their time here if they need anything from us. So that really goes back to that communication and advocacy that was talked about earlier. And this next bullet point, I think, is probably something you've heard of before if you've attended any of these or had conversations, right? And recognizing that the college setting, the goal is not to necessarily guarantee student success, but to provide equal access and opportunity for the student. And so kind of putting that in perspective, I'm going to keep mentioning Katie here, but right, that example about a retake, right? Or modifying course content. We're not allowed to do those or make those sort of modifications because that does fundamentally alter an assignment, a test, a course, or a program. And so those are the things that we need to keep in mind as we are setting realistic expectations for students in the transition, that there are going to be things that are going to be different. And it's good for them to be prepared for some of those changes and recognizing what are those generally reasonable things, what are those things that are not generally reasonable, and having a shared understanding of that. Students who kind of come with that approach are generally more prepared, right, for kind of what to expect in the transition and adjust a little bit easier to maybe some of those expectations. So just something for folks to keep in mind as we're having those discussions, that ultimately that's the lens there. And then the last bullet here, before we kind of transition to questions, is that I think, at least for me, I think sometimes there's misconceptions about what our staff actually know and what information that we have access to. So obviously for us, we're protected under FERPA. So we are not disclosing any information about the student to a family member unless there's a release of information. And even if there is a release of information, we typically do not have access to that type of information. And so what I would encourage students and families to think about as they're transitioning, if the family member or supportive person has been very involved in the students' planning for their accommodations throughout their K-12 system, they should be promoting open lines of communication if they're struggling, right? Like being clear about what's happening, having a safe person to go to. I think sometimes students don't do that. And there's a lot of, understandably, like shame and guilt about maybe not doing as well as they'd hoped. But again, it kind of comes down to that open line of communication and recognizing again that the student is ultimately responsible for, we have Canvas, our learning management system, for tracking their grades, their scores, looking at all of these things. And I often tell them, just because there's no news doesn't mean that's good news. So just paying attention. Sometimes it goes out of sight, out of mind, and things happen, but ultimately they need to be doing that. And if they have concerns, right, they can always come to our office. And again, as Katie noted, each campus has slightly different supports in terms of who would be best suited to work with that student. Maybe it's our office, maybe they're connected to another office on campus that can help them navigate that a little bit more in more intensive sort of academic coaching or supports to kind of work through that. But ultimately, we need to recognize that it is the student's responsibility, and again, communicating across those lines to support them. So I think that's it for that area. And if I'm remembering correctly, I think the next slide is questions.
As we wrap up today's webinar, I want to take a moment to thank our presenters, Katie and Alicia, for sharing their expertise and valuable insights. We greatly appreciate your knowledge and the work that you do. On behalf of the Universities of Wisconsin, I also want to thank all of you for joining us today as well. Please don't hesitate to reach out to the Go Wisconsin team with any questions, or if you would like to be connected with campus resources. Thank you again, everyone, and have a great day.